to Mr. Gosling. Do you believe that the British people were aware of these consequences, especially those who voted for Brexit?
Well, look, just a minute. Take a deep breath, because this Yellowhammer report is a worst-case scenario. So this is if everything goes really badly wrong. This is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And we've just heard from Rodney there. This is being taken as if this is some sort of crystal ball prediction, as this is what will happen. Also, this is if we don't do anything as well. So there's two reasons why we should be very sceptical about whether the things that were predicted in Yellowhammer are actually going to take place. Of course, the government are doing quite a lot in order to make these things aren't allowed to happen. So, first of all, it's a worst-case scenario. And secondly, this is if nothing happens. I mean, Keir Starmer from the Labour Party, a Remainer, has said it's dishonest today to the British people who will be considerably hit in this way if there's no deal Brexit. But he is making the same mistake, as if this is fact. Now, I mean, Brexit is a massive, massive blow to the European project, to the attempt to consolidate power in Brussels. Just imagine if Texas voted to leave the United States of America. What would happen then? Of course, you'd have an enormous amount of pressure on Texas not to leave the USA, especially if they said, oh, actually, we want to join Mexico. So this is where democracy comes a bit unstuck, is where you have a referendum because people believe that too much power is being concentrated in the centre, and actually they are confirmed because they're ignored, as many across Europe and the powerful corporations and banks and the funders of the Remain parties have, but basically ignored the British people, and they keep trying to delay Brexit. This is, I suppose, the sort of thing you should expect from any bunch of people who are trying to consolidate power to themselves. And that's why I think it's still quite possible that Boris Johnson and his friends will find a way to get out of the EU on the 29th of October, and actually then start to negotiate a much better deal than Theresa May gave us, which was an appalling deal. I mean, really, it was as if the EU had written it themselves. And I've seen this week, her chief Brexit negotiator, Olly Robbins, has been given a job at Goldman Sachs, which is the big globalist bank which is running half of Europe now, appointing technocrat financial ministers and even prime ministers across most of southern Europe. Goldman Sachs people are now running many of those countries, and they have been for the last few years, because the EU doesn't accept people's budgets. Say the Italian budget, for example, the Greek budget, the EU just says no, we will only allow a budget if you have one of these nice Goldman Sachs people in. So, you know, the chief negotiator for Theresa May has now got a job at Goldman Sachs. She was a Remainer all along, by the way, and that's why we've got a new broom with Boris Johnson, and actually there's many people on the EU gravy train who are now turning on him.
Thank you very much for your comments, Mr. Gosling. Let's turn back to Mrs. Shakespeare. We're running out of time, so if you could please make it as short as you can. If there are any remarks, particularly regarding what Mr. Gosling said, I would be glad if you would mention that. But also, if you could tell us, now the deal that the EU has proposed is definitely not something that the Parliament will pass. The issue of the backstop, the Irish backstop, is still on the table. There are several issues. So what is going to happen eventually?
Well, very quickly, in response to Tony, first of all, if you look at the people behind Brexit, they want Singapore on Thames, a lot of insecure, low-paid jobs. That's what they're up to. I'm not saying Europe is fine, but that's what the hardline Brexiteers are up to. Secondly, look at the name of the document. It's Yellowhammer. Yellowhammer is a songbird, and its song, replicated in English, is little bit of bread and no cheese. And that really tells you the message is that basics, the British people will survive, but there's going to be a lot of trouble, and the frills and the, say, variety of food, etc., can be severely disrupted. Lastly, on your last point, one of the issues is going to be that if you go with what Johnson is up to, there's going to be a border down the Irish Sea. And I can't see how they actually solve this. At some point, there's going to be disruption and tension coming back to Northern Ireland if the hard Brexit goes forward. And nobody wants that.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shakespeare. Mr. Gosling, we have only 1 minute. If you have any comments to make, we have only 1 minute left. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the Eurozone is going into recession today. There's an emergency meeting because the German economy is crashing. Now, it's very lucky that Britain has still got the pound. Let's also look at the funding for the referendum. It's between 2 and 3 times more money, £7 million spent by the Remain campaign and 2.8 million by the Leave campaign. And also the government at the time also campaigned to Remain. So all the pressure has been to Remain. Despite all that, the British people said, no, we want to leave. And they're really testing the political class now to see if the political class will honour that decision, to see whether Britain really is a democracy. So I agree with many of the points that Rodney's making, but we do have to see, I think, whether our politicians can deliver what the people want, because that's what democracy means. Is Parliament sovereign? No. Parliament gets its sovereignty from the people, and we've seen through the last 2-3 years that Parliament has just failed to deliver because many of the parties are stuffed with people who are pro-EU deliberately through the selection process, and those people have been flushed out by the likes of Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tony Gosling, journalist and commentator joining us from Bristol, and Mr. Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics, joining us from London. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Obviously, this is an issue that we need more time to discuss, but we also are going to have to wait and see what's going to happen. And thanks to all of our viewers for following this edition of the News Review.